Well, as she said, I'll be talking about the perspectives of a missionary child. And I'd like to start with prayer, if that's okay. I know that'll settle me down. Yes. Lord, I just thank you for this opportunity to be here with these wonderful ladies, Lord, and also for my mother to be here, especially since she was just in the hospital, Lord. And I just thank you for her quick recovery. And Lord, I thank you for all the things that they are doing here for missionaries, Lord. And I just pray for those missionaries, Lord, that you will surround them with your protection, that you will give them wisdom from the Holy Spirit to do the best job that they can do, and also for good health. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Yeah. So I wanted to start out with just in case you don't know, but I know you do, what I will be dealing with is there something wrong? Oh, right there. Oh, thank you. I will be dealing with foreign missions because that's what I was, the child of a foreign missionary. And my parents went to a different culture, and that's the definition of a foreign mission. And I wanted to start paraphrasing a story about Apostle Paul that shows what I saw on the mission field. And that comes from Acts 14, 8 through 20. And Paul was in the town of Lystra, and he saw a man that he knew immediately was open to the work of God in his life. And he said, "Get up and walk. Do you want to do that?" And the man just stood up and he was healed. And the whole town was just marveling, and they decided that he and Barnabas were gods. Well, Paul would use any occasion he could to start witnessing about the God that he loves so much and about the love of God. And it made some Jewish people there very angry. They considered that heresy, and they actually got the mob going, and they pulled Paul out of the city and stoned him and left him for dead. Now, he got surrounded by the disciples, and it doesn't say in the Bible, but I imagine they prayed for him. And he just got right up and went right back in that town. Can you imagine the courage that took? And that passion that it took, and that love for the people in that town. And then the next day he took off and went somewhere else new. That's even more incredible. Well, that's the kind of people that I grew up with. They were passionate for their work. And my parents were Natalie and Edward Barber. My father had passed away in 2015, and his ashes are right out here in the columbarium. And my mother and he were in the church here many years. I think it was since 1994. Is that correct? And he loved this church dearly, as did my mother, and was very involved here in this church. They were foreign missionaries for 20 years, and then they went into national missions and had small Spanish-speaking churches in Mexico. And then he went into being a pastor, a Methodist pastor. They served in 3 countries, and my mother's told you about them. It was Chile, Bolivia, and Spain. And in Chile, they were teachers, but I didn't want to start right then. I can't tell my story without starting to tell what their story was. My mother was an orphan, and she was brought up, a very young orphan, and she was brought up by a loving aunt, and she took her to be her own daughter. She was a wonderful person. And my father came from over the tracks. He was very poor. His dad was a factory worker and an alcoholic. They had I think they had 6 children. They were 8 total. It was very hard. He went to work when he was 13 and worked the rest of his life. And they met in college. He was able to go on the GI Bill, took advantage of that. And she, with the inheritance of one of her uncles. And of all places, they met in the Methodist Student Center, which I just loved. And they one day had a missionary come to visit the Student Center. And she told him about the vibrant and missions program of the Methodist Church. And after that, they started talking. He hadn't had courage to tell her, but he felt that the Lord had called him to be a missionary during the war. And he didn't know what she'd think. Well, my mother, when she was a child, read and read and read, and all she dreamed of was adventure. So yes, she was ready to go. And they after 2 years of working as teacher, well, my dad was a teacher, they applied for the Methodist Church missions, were accepted, and this is the part I can't imagine. They had 8 weeks of training for 20 years of work. Can you imagine that? It was just unimaginable. The journey down to South America, it alone, I don't think I could have done it with the courage. My mother had never been on a plane. It was a prop plane. They didn't have jets in those days. It took 24 hours. She said when they got over the Caribbean, they hit terrible turbulence. They hit one where the plane dropped really far, and her dinner tray went flying into the aisle. And the stewardess said, "Oh, this is nothing. You should be here during the hurricane season." And then it got dark because it was 24 hours. And she said, "I looked out at that engine and I could see sparks. I was sure it was going to catch on fire." They stopped many times and they finally made it to Antofagasta, Chile, where they had been assigned. And the first thing the missionary that had come to meet them was he took them out to eat with the bishop. Can you imagine that? And they were served a wonderful Chilean soup, but there was a problem. The soup had a small worm floating around in the soup. And she found out later that was quite common. And she turned to the missionary and she said, "There is a worm in my soup." And he said, "Oh, just take it out. It's been cooked all together. It's extra protein." And so they took another plane, a smaller one, and went to Iquique, Chile. Now I want to tell you about Chile. The lower part is gorgeous with high Andes mountains and lakes and green. The upper part is the driest desert in the world. It rains every 25 years, and that's where Iquique was. The mountains that were behind the city were completely bare. Not a plant grew on them. Can you imagine that after being in New England? What a shock that was. And then the stores, she said the stores had no diversity. There's one kind of oil, one kind of whatever you were looking for. Meat had to be bought and eaten that day. And it was just such a shock. But you know, they prospered there. They learned. And they learned the language. My dad quickly. He was one of those lucky people that just learned it quickly. It just was his natural talent. My mother did too eventually. Our second that one, no, I forgot one point. That's where my brother and I were born. I was born, yeah, that's sort of important. Uh, I was born in the middle of their term, and he was born right before they left. And so we were both Chilean, dual citizen, Chilean citizens and Americans. And we went from there back to the United States on a furlough, and then back to Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is another country with contrast. It has high plains that are 14,000 feet, and that's where a lot of the highland Indians live. It has Andes mountains that go to 22,000 feet. And one looked over one of the towns we lived, it was 21,000 feet, absolutely gorgeous mountain. And the cities were nestled in valleys in the main cities in those Andes mountains. And then there was jungle. Half the country's jungle. And the missionaries were in the highlands, the cities, and the jungles, all of them. In their first term in Bolivia, we were in Cochabamba. That was the second largest city. There's a huge Methodist school there. It's first grade through 12th. And my dad was in administration and my mother taught. And I actually, as soon as I was old enough, was in that school, in the primary school, and I learned to read in Spanish, which ended up being quite a problem when I had to learn how to read in English, which I did not like. It was there that my father felt that he had a calling to be a pastor also. So he had two jobs. And he and another missionary started a church. And it was a very small church at first. In fact, I do remember this. I don't have much memories of Chile. We did go back when I was 12. Bolivia, that's when my memories start building up. And I remember at first it was just an adobe shell. My mother played the organ, which they carried in. It folded into a wooden box with a handle, and she pedaled it. It was incredible. And she played it for my dad. She has a wonderful picture of the crippled children's home children that were being brought to the church. I've seen that all the time when she shows her pictures of the mission work. And she also, it eventually had all walls and was a church. My dad was so close to some of the families, especially the Recalde family. He just dearly loved them. And from there, we went again to another furlough and came back to La Paz, we were assigned. And this is where my parents really flourished. My dad became an administrator, the assistant to the whole church work there. And my mother got the dream job. She had a quarterly newsletter that she sent out to the missions people back in the United States, probably groups like this, that they could read and keep up with her work. She was a reporter. She'd go around different places asking the missionaries for stories. And I remember always typing away on her typewriter. And there, my brother and I went to a one-room schoolroom with all different grades and a Canadian documents and things like that we studied. I noticed my history was not very good, and American history, and she was telling me yesterday, well, that's because you were studying a course of study of Canada. And so luckily my husband is a wonderful history teacher, and he's caught me all up. And so I attended the last year there in the American School of Madrid, and that's where I really flourished. I love that school. Our fourth term was not with the Methodist Church. he took a sabbatical, and we got asked to go to Spain, which was miraculous. My parents would always say, when you grow up, we're going to take you to Europe, but they didn't know where the money was going to come from. So the Lord provided that. And that experience was wonderful. He worked with Cuban refugees coming from Cuba, and he gave them all the paperwork and worked on that, and they volunteered in his office. I remember sitting and talking to them. My mother started her book there, so I wanted to show you this. I've donated one of these to the church that actually belonged to one of your pastors that just passed away. Eugene was his name. And so we've donated that, and you can read, check it out and read it if you're interested. I'm very lucky. If I forget a detail of my childhood, well, I just read it in the book. So anyway, my brother and I there attended the American School of Madrid, and that was so exciting. I had friends from Israel, friends from Thailand, friends from Philippines, and then friends of people like one of my best friends. Her dad was the vice president of Sears, and there were a lot of diplomats there, and I was with them. The highlight of that time was I got to meet James Michener. He was writing Iberia, and he came to our English class. So, and we got to ask him questions about writing. It was so exciting. So I wanted to tell you about the furloughs. They were supposed to be times of rest. But my parents worked so hard. They would go to the churches that were supporting them. The first furlough we went to, when I was 4, my dad went back to college and got his master's in high school administration, and he was an administrator. That's what he found out on the mission field. He was a wonderful administrator. And then the second one, he went to Garrett Seminary. He had started his studies in Cochabamba in Spanish. Can you imagine doing theology in Spanish? He did have a missionary in charge of him that would, watch a mentor. And then my mother went to Northwestern in journalism, and the Lord was preparing her for that job that she did in Bolivia. The third time we came to Prescott, Arizona, we'd had missionaries tell us about what beautiful place that was. And it was a time of rest for my dad. In La Paz, he had 3 jobs. He was assistant administrator, church hospital chaplain, and then on top of that, at the end of his term, he had a new church. And so he was really, really worn out. He rested for about 6 months when we got the call from church world service, and left immediately. And so he only got 6 months of rest. And when we got there to Spain, he was just a mess. He was really worn out. And my mother had to give him special food and everything. So what was my childhood like? We were very aware of our parents' dependence on God. We watched their faith grow. They weren't perfect. I know all their imperfections. But the Lord wanted them so much to do his work, and he grew them on the mission field and developed them into what he would want them to be. I remember my father poring over commentaries and getting ready for a Spanish sermon. And we always had evening devotions. And then I was very aware that each parent would go and have their own devotions. And because of their example, my brother and I both accepted the Lord as our Savior. And that is one of my most wonderful gifts they gave me is my faith. We had wonderful adventures. I'm just going to name a few. There's a lot more in this book. We climbed, my dad drove up a mountain called Chocotaya. He probably went to about 16,500 until it got too icy. And then we got out of the car and climbed up to the highest cosmic ray laboratory in the world. We went to 17,200 feet. My mother was a little worried about the altitude. My brother and I were running around, but we did fine because we were living at 12,000 feet and our lungs had expanded. We also traveled Bolivia's death row. It was a very, very dangerous road. It has been closed. It's only used by bikers now. It was pretty much 1 lane wide, and it went over the beautiful mountains and then down into the jungle, back and forth, back and forth. I got a little car sick. And that when a car came going the other direction, you had to kind of pull over to the side and cross your fingers that you weren't going to fall off the cliff. It was a dirt road. So that was incredible. My brother, Mark, was a little bit more mischievous than I. And one adventure he had with his friend Johnny, another missionary kid, is that he climbed on top of the hospital roof, probably found a secret door, and then laid on a skylight that was over the operating table. And the doctors looked up because they saw a shadow, and there were these 2 missionary kids looking over them. Well, I don't think they stayed there very long because they were in trouble. So Spain and Europe were wonderful. My mother said we saw 2,000 castles, but I don't know. I never counted them. And we went in the middle of our term, we took a Eurail pass. We went to Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, and France. So it was wonderful. It was an incredible, incredible blessing. I want you to know that being in a foreign country was normal to us, to my brother and I. Being in the United States was a foreign country and very exciting. What we would do when we come back to the States when we were young, she said we run all over the Board of Missions building on Riverside Drive in New York, drinking out of water fountains. Because in Bolivia, the water had to be boiled. We thought it was the most wonderful thing we'd ever seen. And we'd go on escalators up and down and elevators and anything. She had trouble keeping up with us. We weren't with our relatives. I hardly knew them. The missionaries became our relatives. And we called them Uncle Paul, Aunt Rachel, and I just lost my Uncle Paul last week. He was the most incredible man. He was the head of the missions. And that was really hard. The kids, we were very close to them. They were like our cousins, and we had several missionary reunions. They've stopped for now because my mother and one lady are the only ones left. It's so sad. But we have minor missionary kids reunions. I went to one in Houston, and we're just like family again. And I got to go visit my friend Mary, Paul's daughter, in Boston this summer. And her husband marveled. I hadn't seen her in 40 years. And yet suddenly we were best friends. He was like, wow, but that's what the mission field did to you. Now, I wanted to talk about how it affected our adult life. My brother well, what we found was that children of missionaries are normally very successful. There's several of them that are PhDs. My friend Mary is a Harvard professor. That my brother was an engineer and very, very successful in Tucson until his death in 2014 from brain cancer. That was a great tragedy in our family. He died too young. My father only lived a year and a half after that. He just thought it was totally wrong for a son to die before the father. My parents were believers in ecumenicalism. They believed in the universal church, Protestant church. So we had friends that were Wycliffe, Presbyterian, anyone that was around. And normally my parents would start Bible studies that were mixed missionaries everywhere they went. And I wanted to tell you about one of them. This one, we even had Catholic nuns and priests. And the Spirit of God came on so strong that even the cat felt it. And we had a parsonage with a long hall. And all of a sudden, our cat ran about 2 feet off the floor, all along the wall. And I think that was because she didn't know how to deal with the presence of God. So, and the thing for myself that was very, very special was they gave me the gift of bilingualism. And I became a bilingual teacher. In Texas, we teach both languages. We start mainly with Spanish. And I taught very young kids. They were immigrants from Central America and Mexico and other countries, El Salvador. And it was so exciting because they were so poor, and I was able to introduce them to the world. I loved their parents. They knew they were in America and that they could have the American dream for their children that were mostly born there. And I followed them. I was there in that one school for 28 years. And I followed these kids. I saw them grow up. I even had a grand student. And they were very successful. The daughter of one of my aides went to college and came back and taught in our same school district, which was, I have a precious picture of her and her daughter. Now I want to go talk about a special thing that happened as an adult with my mother and I, and I'm going to end with that story. When I've been away from home about 11 years, my husband had passed away. I was only 30 years old. He had died from cancer, and he had left me with 2 children. And about 6 months after his death, I just was really yearning to be with the comfort of being with my missionary family. And so I called my parents. I've lived in Austin my whole adult life, Austin, Texas, and said, could you come to Austin and let's go back east where a lot of the missionaries were from. And let's visit the ones that are back in the United States. And it would just make me feel so much better. My dad couldn't because he had just gotten a new church in Albuquerque. And so my mother and I took off on our adventures. We both love adventures, and headed back east. We went 3,600 miles. We saw Uncle Paul and Aunt Rachel, my friend Mary, my godmother from Chile in Long Island. We went to Chicago and visited Lutheran missionaries we were close to there. And then we started our way home. I was exhausted, and especially driving through Chicago. And I asked my mother if I could go to sleep. And she said, yes, I'll be glad to drive. So she was driving. We got about halfway through Illinois when I woke up as if someone had poked me, she said. And in front of me was a sign of Washington, Illinois, in 2 miles. I said, Mama, Edna Ficht lives in Washington. And she said, I didn't know that. Your dad deals with the correspondence. And I said, well, she lives right there. It's only 30 miles off the road. Let's go. We had never met Edna Ficht. She was an incredible lady. She got our names off the calendar, the prayer calendar. She wrote us on all our birthdays, which means she got everybody else's birthday too. She sent little tracts and balloons or whatever in the mail. And then she would say, I am praying for you. And we had never met her. She did that. And what fascinated me, she continued while I was an adult and dealing with 5 years of cancer. I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. And I just wanted to meet her. And so we went, found the telephone book, which wouldn't work now, looked her up, and she said, sure, come right over. Can you imagine that? Strangers. And we got there, and there she was in the epitome of Norman Rockwell with a white picket fence and permed hair and a dress and an apron. And she took us in and sat us down, and then she said, the strangest thing, now who are you? And my mother said, Natalie Barber. And she said, let me go get my address book. And so she came out with an address book that was that thick. She was writing that many Methodist missionaries. And she looked at Natalie, and then she said, oh, I have Natalie Barber in my house. And my mother said, I suddenly felt like a VIP. And we stayed there about an hour getting to know her, and then we were off again. And you know, she kept writing, and then one day they stopped. I don't even think her children knew all these people that she had been supporting in cards and prayers. It was incredible. Now, in in the Bible, it talks about that we should go, in Acts 1, 8 through 9, that we should go to Judea, which is local. And then the word I hadn't really noticed till I was watching, my husband pointed it out for this talk. I thought it said, and then to Samaria, and then to the world, but it doesn't say that. It says, and go to Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the world. He wants us involved in all of it. And I can see that happening in this church. I'm very, very excited. Samaria and also the local things that you do right here with the sweaters. We saw that when we watch your service every time we're here with my mother. When they were younger, we would come to the church, but it's just kind of hard for her. And we're just blessed by everything that you do. I want to give a special thanks to Jan and Chris over here for all that they did recently for my mother while she was in the hospital. They took very good care of her since I couldn't be here. And I'm just really grateful for that. So thank you for letting me speak. And I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, I had one more thing. My mother wanted you to see. This was what my brother and I looked like in La Paz. I was 10 and he was 8. He was 2 years younger, my precious brother. So, well, thank you.